The morning sun peeked through the thin curtains of the small hospital room as Lucia opened her eyes. Her hand instinctively moved to her swollen belly, feeling the gentle kicks of her unborn child. She smiled despite her exhaustion. After 8 months of waiting, she would soon meet her baby girl. "How are you feeling?" asked her husband, Paolo, who had been dozing in the uncomfortable chair beside her bed. His eyes were lined with worry, but his smile was warm. "She's restless today," Lucia replied, wincing slightly as another kick came. "I think she's eager to join us." Paolo placed his hand next to hers, his face lighting up when he felt the movement. This was their first child after 5 years of trying, of disappointment and heartbreak. Each kick was a small miracle to them. The doctor had warned them that Lucia's pregnancy was high risk due to her age and medical history. They had been careful, following every instruction, attending every checkup, but nothing could have prepared them for what happened next. Later that afternoon, Lucia felt a sharp pain unlike anything she had experienced before. It wasn't like the practice contractions she'd been having. This was different, wrong. "Paolo," she gasped, clutching her stomach. "Something's not right." Paolo jumped up, his face draining of color. He rushed to the door, calling for help. Within moments, a nurse hurried in, took one look at Lucia, and pressed the emergency button on the wall. Everything became a blur after that. The room filled with medical staff. Voices overlapped, speaking in urgent tones. Words like fetal distress and emergency delivery floated around Lucia as they wheeled her bed toward the operating room. "Paolo," she cried out, reaching for him. "I'm here," he said, jogging alongside the bed, holding her hand tightly. "I'm not leaving you." But at the double doors of the operating room, a nurse stopped him. "You need to wait here, sir. We'll take good care of them." The last thing Lucia saw before the anesthesia took hold was Paolo's frightened face as the doors swung shut between them. In the waiting area, Paolo paced back and forth. The small rural hospital in southern Brazil wasn't equipped with the latest technology. The power occasionally flickered due to the thunderstorm raging outside. Each time the lights dimmed, Paolo's heart seemed to stop. His sister Anna arrived, having driven through the storm to be there. "Any news?" she asked, embracing him. Paolo shook his head. "Nothing. It's been over an hour. That's normal for a C-section," Anna reassured him. "Remember when my Luis was born? I was in there for nearly 2 hours." But Paolo couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The hospital was too quiet, the staff avoiding his eyes when they passed. When the doctor finally appeared, his surgical mask hanging around his neck and his scrub stained with blood, Paolo knew. "Mr. Oliveira," the doctor said, his voice gentle but tired. "Please sit down," Paolo refused. "Where is my wife? Where is my daughter?" "Your wife is stable. The surgery was difficult, but she'll recover." The doctor paused, and in that pause, Paolo's world began to crumble. "I'm deeply sorry, but there were complications with your baby. She was born very premature and her lungs weren't fully developed." "But she's alive?" Paolo asked, his voice breaking. The doctor placed a hand on Paolo's shoulder. "We did everything we could. She was very small, just under 2 pounds. Her heart was beating when she was born, but she couldn't breathe on her own. We tried for 45 minutes to resuscitate her, but..." The doctor's voice trailed off. Paolo's legs gave way. Anna caught him, helping him into a chair. "No," he whispered. "No, please. I'm so sorry," the doctor said again. "Would you like to see her? To say goodbye?" Paolo couldn't speak. He nodded, tears streaming down his face. The nurse led them to a small room off the main ward. It was quiet there, peaceful. On a table lay a tiny bundle wrapped in a white blanket. Paolo approached slowly, afraid of what he would see. The nurse gently folded back the blanket to reveal the tiniest human Paolo had ever seen. His daughter was perfectly formed, with delicate fingers and a small round face. She looked like she was sleeping. "She's beautiful," Anna whispered, tears in her eyes. Paolo reached out with trembling fingers to touch his daughter's cheek. Her skin was cool to the touch. "She looks like Lucia," he said softly. The nurse nodded sympathetically. "What was her name going to be?" "Isabella," Paolo replied. "Isabella Maria Oliveira." "That's a beautiful name," the nurse said. "Would you like some time alone with her?" Paolo nodded, not taking his eyes off his daughter's face. When the nurse left, he carefully picked up the small bundle. She weighed almost nothing in his arms. "Hello, Isabella," he whispered. "I'm your papa." I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. His voice broke and the tears came freely now. I had so many plans for us. I was going to teach you to ride a bike and how to fish in the river behind our house. Your mama was going to teach you to bake bread like her grandmother taught her. Anna placed her arm around her brother's shoulders as he cradled his daughter. She knows, Paolo. She knows how much you both love her. They stayed there for nearly an hour, Paolo memorizing every detail of his daughter's face. Eventually, the nurse returned. Mr. Oliveira, your wife is waking up. She's asking for you. Paolo looked up, suddenly terrified. How do I tell her? I'll be right beside you, Anna promised. The walk to Lucia's recovery room felt like the longest of Paolo's life. Each step was heavier than the last. When he entered the room, Lucia was pale, her eyes unfocused from the medication, but she smiled when she saw him. Paolo, she said weakly, where's our baby? I want to hold her. Paolo sat beside her bed and took her hand. The words stuck in his throat. How could he say them aloud? How could he break her heart like his had been broken? Lucia, he began, his voice barely audible. There were complications. He watched as understanding dawned on her face, followed by denial, then desperation. No, she said, shaking her head. No, I can feel her. I can still feel her kicking. I'm so sorry, my love, Paolo said, gathering her into his arms as she began to sob. She was too small. Her lungs weren't ready. Lucia's cries echoed through the small hospital room, a sound of such raw pain that the nurses outside wiped away their own tears. She begged to see her daughter, and though the doctor advised waiting until she was stronger, she insisted. When they brought Isabella to her, Lucia held her close, singing softly the lullabies she had practiced for months. She's perfect, she whispered. Look at her tiny nose, just like yours. The hospital staff gave them as much time as they needed. The older nurse, who had seen many tragedies in her 30 years at the hospital, arranged for a photographer who specialized in remembrance photos to come. You'll want these memories, she told them gently. Even though they're painful now, they'll be precious to you someday. As night fell, the doctor approached them about arrangements. In their small town, burials typically happened quickly, especially for infants. The local custom was to hold a wake at home, then a burial the following day. We can keep her here overnight, the doctor offered. Give you time to make arrangements. But Lucia couldn't bear the thought of leaving her daughter alone in the cold hospital. We'll take her home, she said firmly. She should be with her family. The hospital provided them with a small white coffin, painfully light as Paolo carried it to his brother-in-law's car. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear night sky filled with stars. Paolo found himself looking up at them, wondering if one of those bright lights was his daughter looking down on them. Back at their modest home, neighbors and family had already gathered. Word traveled fast in small communities. The living room had been cleared, with the small coffin placed on a table covered with a white cloth. People brought flowers until the scent of them filled the house. As was tradition, they would stay with Isabella through the night, saying prayers and sharing memories, though in this case, the memories were of hopes and dreams that would never come true. The actual burial would take place the next afternoon. Lucia sat beside the coffin, refusing to leave even when urged to rest. Paolo brought her tea that went cold, food that remained untouched. Family members took turns sitting with her, but no one could reach through her grief. We did everything right, she said to Paolo as midnight approached. Why did this happen? Paolo had no answer. He simply held her hand, both of them keeping vigil over their daughter's tiny coffin as the night grew deeper and the house gradually quieted, most mourners having gone home to return in the morning. Neither of them could have imagined that in just a few hours, their world would be turned upside down once again, in a way that would stun not just their small community, but medical professionals around the country. The hours of the night crawled by. Paolo dozed off occasionally in the armchair near the window, his sleep fitful and troubled. Lucia remained awake, her eyes fixed on the small white coffin that held their daughter. The candles placed around the room cast long shadows on the walls, their light occasionally catching on the gold crucifix hanging above the doorway. By early morning, the house began to stir again. Paolo's mother arrived with fresh bread and coffee, her eyes red from crying. She embraced her son and daughter-in-law without words. There were none that could ease their pain. You should eat something, she told Lucia gently. Just a little. Lucia shook her head. I can't. For your health, the older woman insisted, placing a small piece of bread in Lucia's hand. You're still recovering. To please her mother-in-law, Lucia took a small bite, though it tasted like nothing in her mouth. The physical pain from her surgery was nothing compared to the hollow ache in her chest. More relatives and neighbors arrived as the morning progressed. The tiny living room filled with hushed voices and quiet sobs. Children were kept outside, playing in the yard under the watchful eye of a teenage cousin. Their laughter occasionally drifted through the open windows, a jarring contrast to the somber atmosphere inside. The local priest, Father Thomas, arrived around 10 o'clock. He was a kind man in his 60s who had baptized many of the town's children, including Paulo himself. He sat with the grieving parents, offering prayers and comfort. God has called this innocent soul to heaven, he said, his weathered hand resting on the small coffin. She will never know pain or suffering. The words were meant to comfort, but Lucia found them hollow. She wanted her daughter here in her arms, not in heaven. She wanted to watch her grow, to hear her laugh, to wipe away her tears when she fell. The injustice of it all burned inside her. Around midday, the undertaker arrived to discuss the burial arrangements. The cemetery was just a short walk from their house on a hill overlooking the town. A plot had been prepared near Paulo's grandparents. The burial would take place at 3 o'clock. As the hours ticked by, more people arrived to pay their respects. Some brought food, others flowers. Many just came to sit quietly, offering their presence as comfort. The small house could barely contain them all. Perhaps we should move her to the church, Father Thomas suggested, seeing how crowded the house had become. But Lucia was adamant. No, she stays here with us until it's time. At 2:30, people began to prepare for the short procession to the cemetery. The men put on their suit jackets, the women adjusted their headscarves. Paulo's brother brought in the car to transport the immediate family. It's time, Father Tomas said gently to Lucia and Paulo. Lucia nodded, rising slowly from her chair beside the coffin for the first time in hours. Her legs were stiff, her surgical wound painful, but she barely noticed. Paulo supported her with an arm around her waist. Before the coffin was closed for the final time, relatives lined up to say goodbye to baby Isabella. They approached one by one, making the sign of the cross, some leaving small tokens, a tiny flower, a handwritten prayer, a silver medal of a saint. Paulo's sister Rosa was one of the last to approach. She had 4 children of her own and had been a source of guidance for Lucia throughout her pregnancy. Rosa leaned over the coffin, whispering a prayer, her hand gently touching the baby's cheek. Suddenly she froze. What is it? Paulo asked, noticing her strange expression. Rosa didn't answer immediately. She leaned closer to the coffin, her ear near the baby's face, her own features twisted in concentration. Rosa? Paulo's voice held a note of concern now. I thought... Rosa shook her head as if clearing her thoughts. It's nothing. My mind playing tricks. She stepped back, allowing the next person to approach. But instead of rejoining the group, she stood to the side, her eyes fixed on the coffin with an odd intensity. As the last relative finished paying respects, Father Thomas approached to say the final blessing before the coffin would be closed. He sprinkled holy water and began to recite the prayer for the dead. Rosa moved forward suddenly, interrupting him. Wait. All eyes turned to her in surprise. I need to check something, she said, pushing past the priest to reach the coffin again. Rosa, what are you doing? Paulo asked, confusion and a hint of anger in his voice. This was hard enough without disruptions. Rosa didn't answer. She leaned over the coffin once more, this time placing her hand gently on the baby's chest. For a long moment she remained perfectly still, her eyes closed in concentration. Then her eyes flew open, wide with shock. She moved. Rosa whispered. I swear I felt her move. A murmur ran through the crowded room. Lucia stepped forward, hope and fear battling in her expression. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely audible. I felt something, Rosa insisted. Like a tiny breath. Paulo shook his head. Rosa, please, don't do this to us. The doctors confirmed. Oh, look. Rosa pointed into the coffin, her hand trembling. Look at her chest. Everyone crowded forward, straining to see. For a moment there was nothing, just the still form of the infant wrapped in white. Then, almost imperceptibly, the smallest movement, a slight rise and fall of the tiny chest. Mother of God, someone whispered. Father Thomas pushed his way through, bending over to look closely. I don't see. Then came a sound that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. A sound so small, so faint it was almost lost in the gasps of the crowd. A tiny whimper like the mewling of a newborn kitten. She's alive, Rosa screamed, backing away from the coffin, her hands covering her mouth in shock. The baby is alive! Chaos erupted in the small room. People cried out, some in fear, others in joy. Father Thomas made the sign of the cross repeatedly, his prayers now ones of thanksgiving rather than mourning. Lucia pushed through the crowd, her pain forgotten, her eyes wild with desperate hope. When she reached the coffin and saw the slight movement of her daughter's chest, heard the soft sounds coming from her tiny lips, she collapsed to her knees. Isabella, she sobbed, reaching into the coffin to touch her daughter's cheek. My baby. Paolo stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. The doctors had pronounced his daughter dead. He had held her cold body in his arms. How was this possible? We need to get her to the hospital. Rosa shouted over the commotion. Now! Her words broke through Paolo's shock. He sprang into action, carefully lifting the tiny bundle from the coffin. The baby's movements were weak, her cries soft, but she was undeniably alive. The car, he shouted to his brother. Start the car. People rushed to clear a path as Paolo carried his daughter through the crowded house. Lucia followed, supported by Rosa, her face a mixture of tears and desperate hope. Outside, the bright afternoon sun momentarily blinded them. The children playing in the yard stopped to stare as the procession that was meant to be heading to a funeral suddenly transformed into a desperate race against time. Paolo's brother had the car running, the passenger door open. Paolo climbed in, still cradling Isabella. Lucia and Rosa squeezed into the back seat. The hospital in town won't have what she needs, Rosa said. Go to the regional hospital in the city. It's further, but they have a proper neonatal unit. The car sped away, leaving behind a crowd of stunned mourners who moments ago had been preparing for a burial and were now witnessing what could only be described as a miracle. In the car, Isabella's cries grew slightly stronger. Lucia reached from the back seat to touch her daughter's tiny hand. Hold on, little one, she whispered. Please hold on. Paolo stared down at the baby in his arms, still not quite believing what was happening. Just hours ago, he had been preparing to bury his daughter. Now her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, her tiny fingers flexing weakly. How is this possible? He asked no one in particular. The doctors said, It doesn't matter what they said, Lucia replied fiercely from the back seat. She's fighting. Our daughter is fighting to live. The drive to the city hospital took almost an hour, the longest hour of their lives. Every few minutes, they checked to make sure Isabella was still breathing. Each tiny cry was both heartbreaking and reassuring, proof that their miracle was continuing. When they finally reached the hospital, Paolo ran inside with Isabella while his brother parked the car. The emergency room staff were initially confused by his frantic explanation. My daughter, they said she was dead. We were about to bury her. But she started crying. A nurse finally understood and called for a doctor. Within moments, Isabella was whisked away to the neonatal intensive care unit, leaving Paolo standing in the hallway, his empty arms still curved as if holding her. Lucia arrived moments later, supported by Rosa. Where is she? Where's our baby? They took her, Paolo said, his voice hollow with shock. The doctors are with her now. They were led to a waiting area where they sat in stunned silence. The reality of what had happened was still sinking in. Their daughter, pronounced dead nearly 24 hours ago, had come back to them just as they were about to say their final goodbye. Someone should call the rest of the family, Rosa said after a while. They'll be wondering what's happening. Paolo nodded and went to find a phone, leaving Lucia sitting with Rosa, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She's going to be okay, Rosa said, though she had no way of knowing if this was true. She's a fighter, your Isabella, Lucia nodded, tears streaming down her face. She came back to us, she whispered. She came back. The waiting room of the regional hospital was a stark contrast to their small community clinic. Bright fluorescent lights hummed overhead, reflecting off polished tile floors. Medical staff rushed past in colorful scrubs, their shoes squeaking against the floor. The antiseptic smell hung in the air, making Lucia's stomach turn. Paolo returned from making his phone calls, his face ashen. I called my mother. She's telling everyone what happened. They're in shock. He sat heavily beside Lucia, taking her hand. The priest is organizing rides for family to come here. Lucia barely heard him. Her eyes remained fixed on the double doors through which they had taken Isabella. Every time they swung open, she straightened, hoping for news. But hour after hour passed with no word. "Why is it taking so long?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. Rosa, who had stayed with them, squeezed her shoulder. "It's a good sign. It means she's still fighting." Finally, nearly 3 hours after their arrival, a doctor emerged. He was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and eyes lined with exhaustion. His name tag read Dr. Cardoso. "Mr. and Mrs. Oliveira?" he asked, approaching them. They stood immediately, Paolo supporting Lucia. "Your daughter is alive," Dr. Cardoso said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "She's extremely weak and her condition is very critical, but she's alive." Lucia's knees gave way and she would have fallen if Paolo hadn't been holding her. "Can we see her?" she asked through tears. Dr. Cardoso hesitated. "She's been placed in an incubator and connected to several machines. It might be distressing for you to see her like this." "Please," Paolo said. "We need to see her." The doctor nodded. "I understand. But first, I need to ask you some questions about what happened. The situation is highly unusual." They sat down again and Dr. Cardoso pulled up a chair to face them. "The rural hospital where your daughter was born sent over her records. According to them, she was pronounced dead yesterday afternoon after failed resuscitation attempts." "That's what they told us," Paolo confirmed. "And you took her home for a wake, as is customary in your community?" They nodded. "And she remained there in the coffin until this afternoon when your sister noticed signs of life?" "My sister-in-law," Lucia clarified. "She said she felt movement and heard a sound." Dr. Cardoso made notes on his clipboard. "I've been practicing medicine for 27 years and I've never seen anything like this." He looked up at them. "What you're describing is extraordinarily rare. There have been documented cases of what we call the Lazarus phenomenon, spontaneous return of circulation after failed resuscitation attempts. But in a newborn, and after so many hours," he shook his head in amazement. "Is she going to be okay?" Lucia asked, the only question that really mattered to her. Dr. Cardoso's expression became serious again. "Your daughter is fighting very hard, but I need to be honest with you. She was born extremely premature. Her lungs are underdeveloped, and she's been without proper medical support for nearly 24 hours. The next 48 hours will be critical." Lucia nodded, tears streaming down her face. Paolo wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Now," Dr. Cardoso continued, "I've called in a neonatologist, a doctor who specializes in newborns, from the capital. She's driving in and should be here within the hour. In the meantime, I'd like to take you to see Isabella." They followed him through the double doors and down a long corridor. The neonatal intensive care unit was at the far end of the hospital, a separate world of beeping machines and hushed voices. Before entering, they were given gowns, masks, and gloves to wear. "We need to protect the babies from outside germs," a nurse explained as she helped them dress. "Their immune systems are very fragile." When they finally entered the NICU, Lucia gasped. The room was filled with incubators, each containing a tiny infant connected to various tubes and wires. The machines around them beeped and hummed, monitoring every heartbeat, every breath. Dr. Cardoso led them to an incubator in the corner. Through the clear plastic they could see Isabella, so small, so fragile. Tubes ran from her nose and mouth, wires attached to stickers on her chest. A tiny IV was taped to her arm, almost as thin as a thread. "She's smaller than when I last saw her," Paolo whispered, his voice breaking. "She's likely dehydrated," Dr. Cardoso explained. "We're giving her fluids and nutrition through the IV. The tubes are helping her breathe." Lucia pressed her hand against the plastic, as close as she could get to touching her daughter. "Can I hold her?" The doctor shook his head gently. "Not yet. The incubator is maintaining her body temperature and protecting her from infection. Once she's stronger, you'll be able to have skin-to-skin contact, which will be very beneficial for her." A nurse approached, checking the monitors and adjusting one of the tubes. "Her oxygen levels have improved slightly in the last hour," she told them with an encouraging smile. "That's a good sign," Dr. Cardoso added. "She's responding to treatment." Lucia couldn't take her eyes off her daughter. Yesterday she had held Isabella's lifeless body, had felt the cold stillness of death. Now, though connected to machines and fighting for every breath, her daughter was alive. The miracle of it was almost too much to comprehend. "I want to stay with her," Lucia said. "Of course," the nurse replied. "There's a chair right here beside the incubator. You can talk to her, she can hear your voice." Paolo helped Lucia into the chair. Her body ached from the surgery and the emotional toll of the past 2 days, but she barely noticed. All her focus was on the tiny life before her. "Isabella," she whispered, leaning close to the incubator. "Mama's here, Papa too. We're not leaving you." Paolo stood behind Lucia, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes never leaving their daughter. Dr. Cardoso quietly excused himself, promising to return with the neonatologist when she arrived. The nurse showed them how to read some of the monitors, explaining what each number meant. "Her heart rate is good and steady," she said, pointing to one of the screens. "And see here? This shows she's making small breathing efforts on her own, even with the help of the machine." Time seemed to stand still in the NICU. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors became a reassuring background noise. Nurses came and went, checking Isabella, adjusting equipment, making notes. Paolo convinced Lucia to eat something from the cafeteria, but she refused to leave for more than a few minutes at a time. Outside the windows, the sun began to set. Family members arrived in small groups, but only Paolo and Lucia were allowed into the NICU. Rosa coordinated with the others, setting up an impromptu waiting area in the hospital lobby. Shortly after nightfall, Dr. Cardoso returned with another doctor, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a determined expression. "Mr. and Mrs. Oliveira, this is Dr. Vera, our neonatologist." Dr. Vera shook their hands warmly. "I've reviewed Isabella's case. It's quite extraordinary." She moved to the incubator, examining Isabella and the various readings on the monitors. Her movements were precise, confident. After several minutes, she turned back to them. "Your daughter is remarkably resilient," she said. "Most premature infants her size wouldn't have survived what she's been through. Does that mean she'll be okay?" Paolo asked hopefully. Dr. Vieira's expression became more measured. "She's still in critical condition. The next 2 days will tell us a lot about her chances. But I've seen cases where babies much sicker than Isabella have made full recoveries." She pulled up a chair to sit across from them. "I'd like to explain what we're doing for her and what our plan is going forward." For the next 20 minutes, Dr. Vieira detailed Isabella's treatment. Some of the medical terms went over their heads, but her calm, straightforward manner was reassuring. "The good news is that she's already showing signs of improvement since being brought in," Dr. Vieira concluded. "Her body temperature has stabilized and her oxygen levels are better than I would have expected." "What about her brain?" Lucia asked, voicing the fear she'd been holding on to. Being without oxygen for so long, Dr. Vieira nodded, understanding the concern. "That's one of our main concerns. We've ordered tests to assess any potential damage. But the human body, especially in infants, has remarkable healing capabilities, and there's a theory that might explain why Isabella survived this ordeal." She leaned forward slightly. "We believe Isabella may have been in a state similar to hibernation. When she was born and struggling to breathe, her body might have entered an extremely slowed metabolic state to preserve brain function. This sometimes happens with drowning victims in very cold water. The cold temperature at the rural hospital, and then during transport, might have actually helped preserve her brain function by slowing her metabolism even further." "Like she was sleeping?" Lucia asked, trying to understand. "In a way, yes. A very deep protective state where the body's needs are minimal." Dr. Vieira smiled gently. "It's still remarkable, but it might explain how she survived without apparent brain activity for so long." A nurse approached with a clipboard. "Doctor, the test results you requested." Dr. Vieira reviewed them, her expression giving nothing away. Paolo and Lucia watched anxiously, trying to read her face for any clue. Finally, she looked up. "These are preliminary but encouraging. Her blood work shows improving kidney and liver function. That's a very good sign." Lucia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Paolo squeezed her shoulder. "I'll be staying overnight to monitor her closely," Dr. Vieira continued. "We'll be adjusting her medications and support as needed. I suggest you both try to get some rest. There are cots available for parents. The nurses will wake you immediately if there's any change." Paolo nodded. "Thank you, doctor." After Dr. Vieira left, they continued their vigil beside the incubator. The hospital provided a cot, which they set up next to Isabella's incubator. Paolo convinced Lucia to lie down while he kept watch. "I'll wake you in a few hours and then you can watch while I rest," he promised. Exhausted beyond measure, Lucia finally agreed. As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, the steady beeping of the heart monitor was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Each beat a tiny, precious miracle. Dawn broke over the hospital, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Lucia woke with a start, momentarily confused by her surroundings. Then reality rushed back, the coffin, the miracle, the hospital. She sat up quickly, her eyes immediately going to the incubator where Isabella lay. Paolo was still awake, sitting close to their daughter. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, stubble covering his chin, but he smiled when he saw Lucia was awake. "Any change?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. The nurse said her oxygen levels improved through the night. He replied, his voice hoarse with fatigue. They reduced the breathing support a little to see how she'd handle it. Lucia placed her hand on the incubator. "Good morning, my little fighter," she whispered. A nurse entered carrying a clipboard. She was middle-aged with a kind face, her hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Good morning," she greeted them. "Dr. Vieira will be making rounds soon. How about I bring you both some breakfast first?" They hadn't eaten properly in days, surviving on coffee and whatever snacks family members had brought. The thought of food made Lucia's stomach growl, reminding her that she needed strength for Isabella. "That would be wonderful. Thank you," Paolo answered. While they ate the simple meal of bread, cheese, and fruit, more staff began to fill the NICU. Shift change brought new nurses who checked each baby carefully, recording vital signs and administering medications. Dr. Vieira arrived, looking surprisingly fresh despite having been at the hospital all night. She greeted them warmly before turning her attention to Isabella. Her examination was thorough, her expression thoughtful as she studied the monitors and made notes. "She had a good night," Dr. Vieira finally said, turning to face them. "Better than I expected, honestly," hope flared in Lucia's chest. "What does that mean?" "It means she's responding well to treatment. Her oxygen levels are improving, and she's showing more spontaneous movement. These are all positive signs." Dr. Vieira smiled, but then her expression became more serious. "However, she's still extremely premature and has been through significant trauma. We need to remain cautious." "But she's fighting," Paolo said, more statement than question. "Yes, she's definitely fighting," Dr. Vieira agreed. "And today I'd like to try something that might help her even more." She explained that when babies are stable enough, skin-to-skin contact with their parents, sometimes called kangaroo care, could have remarkable benefits. It helped regulate their temperature, breathing, and heart rate and promoted bonding. "Do you think Isabella is ready for that?" Lucia asked, hardly daring to hope. "I think we can try for a short period," Dr. Vieira replied. "It will mean disconnecting some of the monitors temporarily, but we'll keep the most essential ones attached." Tears filled Lucia's eyes. Since the moment Isabella was born, she had longed to hold her properly, to feel her warmth, to give her comfort. The thought that it might finally happen was overwhelming. "When?" she asked. "Let's give the nurses about an hour to prepare everything," Dr. Vieira said. "In the meantime, you might want to freshen up. There's a family bathroom with a shower down the hall." After Dr. Vieira left, Paolo insisted that Lucia go first. "You'll be the one holding her," he said. "Take your time." In the small hospital bathroom, Lucia stood under the hot water, letting it wash away days of grief and fear. She was still sore from her surgery, the stitches pulling whenever she moved too quickly. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional roller coaster they'd been on. She dressed in clean clothes that Rosa had brought from home, brushed her hair, and even applied a touch of lip balm. It felt strange to care about such things, but she wanted to look her best for Isabella, not drawn and haggard as she had been. When she returned to the NICU, Paolo took his turn to clean up. Lucia sat beside the incubator, talking softly to Isabella about their home, the garden she had planted, the small crib waiting in their bedroom. "Your papa painted it yellow," she told her. "He said yellow is a happy color, good for boys or girls. We hung little stars from the ceiling that glow in the dark. You'll see them when you come home." The word when, not if, felt important. Lucia refused to consider any outcome other than bringing Isabella home. By the time Paolo returned, the nurses were ready. They had prepared a comfortable reclining chair with pillows for support. They carefully explained how they would transfer Isabella from the incubator to Lucia's chest, which tubes and wires would remain connected, and what to watch for. "Are you ready?" the head nurse asked. Lucia nodded, unable to speak through her emotion. She sat in the chair and opened the top buttons of her blouse as instructed, creating a space where Isabella could lie directly against her skin. With practiced care, the nurses lifted Isabella from the incubator. She looked even tinier outside of it, her skin almost translucent, her chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. They placed her gently on Lucia's chest, positioning her so the breathing tube wasn't disturbed, then covered them both with a warm blanket. The moment Isabella's skin touched hers, Lucia felt it, a connection so powerful it took her breath away. Tears streamed down her face as she cradled her daughter, feeling the rapid flutter of her tiny heart. "Hello, my love," she whispered. "Mama's got you now." Paolo stood beside them, his own eyes wet with tears. He reached out to stroke Isabella's head, covered with a soft fuzz of dark hair. "Look at that," one of the nurses said, pointing to the monitor. "Her oxygen levels are already improving." It was true. The numbers on the screen were climbing slowly but steadily. Isabella's breathing, which had been rapid and irregular, began to settle into a more even rhythm. "She knows she's home," Paolo said softly. For the next 30 minutes, Lucia held their daughter against her heart. Isabella's tiny fingers curled and uncurled, occasionally gripping the fabric of Lucia's blouse. Her eyes, which had been closed, fluttered open briefly, dark, unfocused, but beautiful. When it was time to return Isabella to the incubator, Lucia didn't want to let go. But she understood that her daughter still needed the specialized support the machines provided. "You'll get to hold her again tomorrow," the nurse promised, as they carefully transferred Isabella back. "A little longer each day as she gets stronger." Throughout the day, doctors and specialists came to examine Isabella. News of the miracle baby had spread throughout the hospital and beyond. A reporter from a regional newspaper called, asking for an interview, which Paolo politely declined. This was a private miracle, not a public spectacle. Dr. Cardoso, who had first received them at the hospital, returned in the afternoon with more test results. He met with Dr. Vieira outside the NICU, their conversation animated but too distant to overhear. When they entered together, their expressions were carefully neutral. "We've received the results of Isabella's brain scan," Dr. Vieira said, pulling up chairs for them all to sit. Lucia's heart pounded. This was what she had been most afraid of, that even if Isabella survived, she might have suffered irreversible damage during those hours without proper medical support. "The results are surprising," Dr. Cardoso began. "In a good way or bad way?" Paolo asked, gripping Lucia's hand. "Good," Dr. Vieira said with a small smile. "Very good, actually. We're seeing minimal signs of oxygen deprivation, much less than we would expect given the circumstances." Lucia let out a shaky breath. "So her brain is okay?" "Based on what we can see, yes," Dr. Cardoso confirmed. "There may be some developmental challenges ahead. That's common with extremely premature infants regardless of other factors. But the severe brain damage we feared? We're not seeing evidence of that. How is this possible?" Paolo asked. "She was without proper medical care for so long." Dr. Vieira leaned forward. "We believe our hibernation theory may be correct. The low temperature in the rural hospital, and then during the wake at your home, may have dramatically slowed her metabolism, essentially putting her body into a state of suspended animation that protected her brain. Additionally," Dr. Cardoso added, "infants have remarkable neuroplasticity. Their brains can adapt and heal in ways adult brains cannot. It's why children can recover from injuries that would be devastating to adults." "So what happens now?" Lucia asked. "Now we continue supporting her as she grows stronger," Dr. Vieira replied. "She'll need to remain in the NICU for several weeks, possibly months. Premature infants typically stay until around their original due date, sometimes longer depending on their progress." "But she's going to live?" Paolo pressed. "She's going to be okay?" The doctors exchanged glances. "In medicine, we try not to make absolute promises," Dr. Vieira said carefully. "But based on her progress so far, I'm cautiously optimistic. Isabella has already proven she's a fighter." That afternoon, word came that representatives from the rural hospital where Isabella had been born were requesting a meeting. The hospital administrator, the doctor who had pronounced Isabella dead, and their legal counsel had arrived. "They're probably worried about a lawsuit," Rosa said when she heard the news during her visit. But Paolo shook his head. "We're not interested in blame or money. We just want our daughter to get well." The meeting was set for the following morning. That night, Paolo convinced Lucia to sleep in a proper bed in the parents' room adjacent to the NICU. She was still recovering from her surgery, and exhaustion would only slow her healing. "The nurses will call us immediately if anything changes," he promised, "and we'll be just down the hall." They slept fitfully despite their exhaustion, both waking frequently to check the time. Before dawn, they were back at Isabella's side, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, marveling at each small movement of her hands and feet. As morning approached, bringing with it the meeting with the rural hospital representatives, Lucia felt a strange calm settling over her. Whatever explanation or apology they offered, nothing could change what mattered most. Isabella was alive, growing stronger by the hour, and showing every sign that she intended to stay that way. The miracle they had been given overshadowed everything else. From the depths of grief to the heights of joy, their journey had transformed them forever, and it was only beginning. 2 years had passed since the day Isabella had cried out from her coffin. The small yellow house at the edge of town was filled with sunshine and laughter as family gathered to celebrate her second birthday. Lucia watched from the kitchen doorway as Isabella toddled across the living room, her dark curls bouncing with each determined step. She clutched a wooden toy in one hand, babbling happily as she made her way to Paolo, who knelt with open arms. "Did you see that?" he called to Lucia. "She's getting faster every day." Lucia smiled, her heart full. Soon she'll be running circles around us both. The journey to this moment had been long and filled with challenges. After that first miraculous week in the hospital, Isabella had continued to surprise everyone with her progress. The meeting with the rural hospital representatives had been tense but ultimately productive. The doctor who had pronounced Isabella dead had been visibly shaken, repeatedly apologizing as he tried to explain what had happened. "We followed all standard protocols," he had insisted. There was no detectable heartbeat, no breathing, no response to stimulation. By every medical definition, she was gone. The hospital administrator had been more pragmatic, focusing on the lack of advanced equipment in their small facility. "We don't have the same monitoring capabilities as a major hospital. Our resources are limited." In the end, rather than pursue legal action, Paolo and Lucia had worked with both hospitals to establish new protocols for confirming infant deaths, particularly in premature babies. The rural hospital had received funding for better equipment, and a special training program had been implemented for staff across the region. Isabella had remained in the NICU for nearly 3 months. Each day brought new milestones. The first time she breathed entirely on her own, the first full feeding without a tube, the first time she maintained her body temperature without the incubator. Lucia had stayed by her side while Paolo split his time between the hospital and work, managing as best he could. The day they finally brought her home was both joyous and terrifying. After months of round-the-clock professional care, they were suddenly responsible for this tiny, precious life. They'd converted their bedroom into a nursery, with the yellow crib positioned where they could see it from their bed, which they'd moved to the living room. Those first few months at home had been exhausting. Isabella required special care, more frequent feedings, careful temperature monitoring, and regular visits to specialists. But with each passing day, she grew stronger. The doctors had warned them about potential developmental delays. Many premature infants, especially those who have experienced trauma, face challenges, Dr. Vieira had explained during one of their follow-up visits. But the brain is remarkably adaptable, particularly in the first few years of life. They had enrolled Isabella in an early intervention program, working with therapists who specialized in infant development. To everyone's amazement, she had hit most of her milestones only slightly behind schedule. She had rolled over at 6 months, sat up at 8, and taken her first steps just before her first birthday. Her speech was still developing. She had a vocabulary of about 20 words, less than some children her age, but within the normal range. Her favorite word was papa, which she used for nearly everything she wanted. Now, watching her play with her father, Lucia felt a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. Every moment of this ordinary day was a gift that had nearly been taken from them. The doorbell rang, pulling Lucia from her thoughts. Rosa arrived with her children carrying a homemade cake decorated with tiny yellow stars, a reminder of the stars that hung above Isabella's crib. "Where's the birthday girl?" Rosa called, setting the cake on the table. "Aunt Rosa," Isabella shouted one of her clearer words, and hurried toward her favorite aunt. More family arrived. Paolo's mother with armfuls of presents, his brother with his wife and new baby, neighbors who had become like family during their ordeal. The small house filled with voices and laughter. Dr. Vieira arrived last, having promised to attend if her hospital duties allowed. She had become more than Isabella's doctor. She was the connection to the miracle that had brought their daughter back to them. "Look at you," she exclaimed, kneeling to Isabella's level. "Such a big girl now." Isabella, suddenly shy, hid behind Lucia's legs, peering out with curious eyes. "She's doing wonderfully," Dr. Vieira said, straightening up. "You'd never know what she went through just by looking at her." It was true. To a stranger, Isabella appeared to be a typical 2-year-old, perhaps a bit smaller than average, but active, alert, and full of personality. The only visible reminder of her difficult start was a small scar on her arm where the IV had been during her hospital stay. After a lunch of Isabella's favorite foods, pasta with cheese, sweet corn, and little cubes of chicken, Paolo carried out the cake with 2 candles flickering on top. Everyone gathered around singing happy birthday as Isabella watched with wide eyes. "Make a wish and blow," Paolo encouraged, lifting her to see the candles better. Isabella stared at the flames, then looked to her mother for guidance. "Like this," Lucia demonstrated, pretending to blow. "Blow out the candles." Isabella puckered her lips and blew a small puff of air, not quite enough to extinguish the flames. Paolo helped with a subtle breath of his own, and everyone cheered as the candles went out. Later, as the party wound down and guests began to leave, Dr. Vieira pulled Lucia and Paolo aside. "I have something for you," she said, handing them an envelope. "It's not exactly a birthday present for Isabella, but I thought you might want to have it." Inside was a letter on official hospital stationery. It described Isabella's case, which had been documented in a prestigious medical journal as one of the most remarkable examples of infant resilience on record. The article had sparked renewed research into neonatal resuscitation protocols and the potential protective effects of controlled hypothermia in newborns deprived of oxygen. "Your daughter's story has already changed medical practices," Dr. Vieira explained. "The research it inspired may save countless other babies in the future." Lucia clutched the letter, tears welling in her eyes. "We never imagined anything good could come from what happened." "That's the thing about miracles," Dr. Vieira said softly. "They ripple outward in ways we can't predict." After the last guest had gone, Lucia sat on the porch swing with Isabella in her lap, gently rocking as the sun began to set. Paolo joined them, wrapping an arm around his wife's shoulders. "Happy?" he asked simply. Lucia nodded, watching as Isabella's eyes grew heavy with sleep. "More than I ever thought possible." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the crickets beginning their evening songs. The nightmare of those first days seemed like a distant memory now, though Lucia knew she would never forget the sight of her daughter in that small white coffin, or the moment when Rosa had cried out that she was alive. Life had given them a second chance, not just for Isabella, but for all of them. It had taught them about the fragility of life, but also its remarkable resilience. It had shown them the depths of despair and the heights of joy, sometimes within the same heartbeat. As Isabella drifted to sleep in her arms, Lucia thought about all the moments that lay ahead. First days of school, lost teeth, skinned knees, birthdays, and holidays. Ordinary moments that made up an extraordinary life, one that had almost never been. Paolo seemed to read her thoughts. "Sometimes I still can't believe she's really here," he said, gently touching Isabella's cheek. "I think about that sometimes too," Lucia admitted. "But then I remember what Dr. Vieira told us when we were still in the hospital. She said that Isabella had fought too hard to come back to us to give up easily. That kind of determination doesn't just disappear." Paolo smiled. "She's going to be a force to reckon with when she grows up." "She already is," Lucia replied, thinking of the strong-willed little girl who insisted on putting on her own shoes even when they ended up on the wrong feet, who climbed everything in sight despite their worries, who faced each new challenge with the same determination that had brought her back from the edge of death itself. The foundation they had established in Isabella's name had already helped improve neonatal care in 3 rural hospitals. They had raised funds for better equipment, sponsored training for medical staff, and provided support for families with premature infants. What had started as a personal tragedy had transformed into a mission that touched many lives. As darkness fell, they carried their sleeping daughter to her room. The little yellow crib had been replaced by a toddler bed, but the stars still glowed softly on the ceiling above. Paolo placed Isabella gently on the bed while Lucia tucked the blanket around her. They stood watching her sleep for a moment, as they did every night, listening to the soft sound of her breathing. It was a sound they would never take for granted. "Good night, our miracle," Lucia whispered, placing a gentle kiss on Isabella's forehead. Hand in hand, they left the room, leaving the door slightly ajar so they could hear her if she called out in the night. But Isabella slept peacefully, dreaming the dreams of a child who knew only that she was loved, unaware of the extraordinary journey that had brought her home. Outside her window, stars filled the night sky, each one a point of light in the darkness, each one a reminder that sometimes, against all odds, miracles happen, and when they do, they change everything.